Hey guys, in this video, Tim is going to be looking at obedience to authority and resistance to social influence. Now, this is all parts of your A-level psychology, so it is really important that you make careful notes from this video. If you want some help in remembering all of those tricky facts, then over on my website there are loads of multiple choice questions for you.
Obedience to authority is following an order, which requires a specific action or range of actions from a figure of authority. The nature of this obedience differs from situation to situation, from authority figure to authority figure, and from individual to individual. The obedience also varies in style. Sometimes obedience is following a specific order to carry out a specific particular action. For example, bringing your car to a stop when you've been specifically instructed to by a member of the police. Sometimes obedience is continually following a known set of rules from an authority figure, such as continuing to wear school uniform every weekday for a number of years. You don't have to be told this every day. The rules are put in place once by an authority figure, and you follow them again and again. Sometimes obedience is conscious, such as following a specific instruction to wait in a given area when attending a job interview. That's a conscious decision that you have made to follow that instruction from an authority figure. Sometimes, though, obedience is unconscious, such as following basic laws without having to continually think about or be reminded of them or specifically recall them. One does not usually need to be consciously told and reminded not to commit murder. It's just something that we don't do. In 1963, a psychologist called Stanley Milgram conducted research using 40 male participants. This study is extremely important, and it's extremely critical for the exams that you understand it in full. So we're going to spend quite a long time today going into every aspect of it. These recruited through flyers and newspaper adverts. In 1963, there was no internet, and therefore no way to recruit using the internet. So recruiting through flyers and newspapers was probably the best way available to reach the best representative cross-section of the wider population at large. Milgram advertised for these participants under the guise of the research being into memory, not obedience, his actual research. This meant that, from the very start of their involvement, all 40 of these participants had already been deceived. They had been told that this was research into memory, not research into obedience. As we'll see, telling them it was research into obedience would tip them off to the method. Participants were aged between 20 and 50, a reasonably large cross-section of the population in terms of age. They were also from a range of professional backgrounds. Some were entirely unskilled labourers, some were skilled labourers, some were managerial, and some were unemployed. So they had a range of professional backgrounds, and therefore probably a reasonably diverse range of educations and personalities. Participants were paid $4.50 for turning up. This is roughly £32 today, so a reasonable amount of money just for attending. The net or overall effect of this recruitment method was to produce a relatively large and relatively diverse sample of participants. They were all male, but they were also from a range of backgrounds. They were in a range of social roles, and they had a range of incomes and possessed a range of ages. Participants were told that they would be assigned a role, as either a teacher or a learner. This was done randomly by the method of them drawing lots. In fact, they always drew teacher, while a confederate drew learner. A confederate, as we've already seen, is someone who acts as a genuine participant, but they're actually working with the researcher and with full knowledge of the experimental method. The confederate, who was always named Mr. Wallace, for unclear reasons, appeared to the participants to also be a genuine participant just like them. This was another element of deception present from the very start of the experiment. A second confederate posed as the experimenter. The participants were told they were there to run the study. These experimenters wore a grey lab coat. That's important and something that we'll come back to. Participants were also informed that they could leave the study at any time. The learner, who was actually a confederate of Milgram acting as a participant, was strapped into a chair in another nearby room, separated from the actual participant by a single wall. The participant, who had by then assumed the role of teacher, was told to give the learner an increasingly severe electric shock every time the learner got the task wrong. The task that the fake learner was undertaking was a very simplistic one, recalling pairs of words. Each time this fake learner made a mistake, the teacher was instructed to shock them. The shocks were actually fake. The learner did not receive a shock, but they acted as if they did. and they then portrayed the appropriate expected response. Remember that these learners were confederates. They were associates of Milgram who were involved in the research. The shocks ranged from a gentle 15 volts to a painful and debilitating and potentially lethal 450 volts. Each shock had a label on the machine. 15 volts was labelled as slight shock, while 450 volts was labelled as danger, severe shock. The participants thought that they were inflicting real and increasingly painful and dangerous shocks to the learner. At 300 volts, the learner would bang on the wall and not respond to the next question, indicating pain, anger, or even injury. At 315 volts, the learner would bang on the wall again and then not give any further answers. This further reinforced the idea that they were enraged or injured. When the teacher, who remember was the participant, asked the lab-coated experimenter for guidance, they were always instructed to continue. The experimenters informed the participants that failure to respond should be taken as an incorrect answer and that they should therefore deliver the next, a more severe and more painful shock. The experimenter had been given a script of 4 standard prods to encourage the participants to continue delivering what they thought were genuine, painful, and dangerous shocks to an innocent participant. The first of these was "please continue" or "please go on," a friendly, encouraging instruction. The second of these was "the experiment requires that you continue," a much more direct and less friendly instruction. The third of these was "it is absolutely essential that you continue," a much more severe instruction. And the fourth and final one was "you have no other choice, you must go on." This is an outright command. Incredibly, Milgram found that none of the participants stopped below 300 volts. Only 12.5%, 1/8, stopped at 300 volts. This was the point at which the fake learner would hammer on the dividing wall in pain or rage or injury. 65%, nearly 2/3 of the participants, continued all the way up to 450 volts, a shock which they believed was dangerous, extremely painful, and potentially even lethal. Remember that each shock value on the apparatus was given a label. Observational results, which are qualitative rather than quantitative, they're not numeric, so data analysis can't be done, showed that as the severity of the shock increased, participants did indeed begin to show signs of extreme tension. They displayed signs of stress, such as biting their fingernails, sweating profusely, rocking back and forth, and trembling in place. They also displayed signs of remorse, such as a similar trembling or groaning. 3 of the participants had what Milgram later described as full-blown, uncontrollable seizures. Several conclusions can be drawn from the experiment that Milgram did in 1963. Milgram concluded that, in general, people will obey orders. This is definitely reinforced by the statistical results of his experiment. Milgram also concluded that people will generally obey orders if they come from a perceived authority figure. Remember that the experimenters were wearing lab coats. Milgram also asked a group of 14 psychology students to predict the result. They predicted that few or no participants would continue all the way up to 450 volts. They thought it ludicrous that anybody would administer that level of shock. These results are therefore unexpected. They weren't what the psychology students who had experience in the field were expecting to happen. Remember that 65% of participants did go all the way up to 450 volts, a truly staggering amount. After the research, all of the participants were debriefed. This was done more to gather more information and explain the test rather than it was to give them therapy or explain how the test was actually done. 84% of them felt glad to have participated, amazingly, although this may have been raised by the fact that they were paid to take part. 74%, about 3/4 of the participants, felt that they had learned something of personal importance while engaged in this odd research. As with all psychological evaluations and psychological experiments, there is an important ethical evaluation to be done. This piece of research, even for 1963, obviously had massive ethical issues. Participants were repeatedly deceived. Indeed, they were deceived a total of 4 times. Firstly, they were told that this was memory research, when in fact it was actually obedience research. Secondly, they were told that the learner on the other side of the wall, banging and screaming in pain, was another participant, somebody as genuine and innocent as themselves, when they were actually a confederate and associate of the researcher. They were led to believe that the shocks were genuine, when they weren't. And fourthly, they were told that roles had been randomly assigned, when in fact they were prearranged and each participant would always be given the role of teacher. Participants suffered stress, recurrent nightmares, regret, remorse, and even depression after the experience. Participants also had severe mental and physical health issues, even in the experiment itself, up to and including breakdowns and seizures. Overall, it's abundantly clear that this piece of research, even for the time period of 1963, was marred to an extent by the number and also by the extremity of the many ethical issues. There are also many methodological conditions which we need to take into account when we're evaluating Milgram's research. This study was done under laboratory conditions. The variables could therefore be controlled, and the results were relatively reliable. Because of this, it is possible to establish a level of cause and effect, a causal relationship between the variables. However, the action being undertaken, shocking a hapless and innocent learner, was unlikely to have ever been replicated in the real world, so the study did lack ecological validity. It was of little relevance to the actual real world outside the laboratory. There is also a question over what is called internal validity of the experiment, how consistent and true it was within itself, and how genuinely participants responded. Some participants did not believe that the shocks were valid. They didn't believe that the shocks were real, although some of these did not realize this until after the research was done. In the heat of the moment, they thought that the shocks they were giving this innocent person on the other side of the wall were completely real. These participants reported that they were just going along with what was expected of them. This is an example of showing demand characteristics, or as we've seen, conforming to an expected social role with set expectations. The experiment was repeatable. It could, in theory, be done again, although ethical concerns meant that it rarely was ever tried. Some variations were done in later years, but this precise and barbaric experiment was never repeated. It could, in theory at least, be done again with a much larger group. From this research, Milgram was able to repeat it shortly after to establish the influence of different variables. These variables that were tested are situational. They vary from environment to environment rather than from individual person to individual person. Other research was also done to establish these situational variables. To take an example, there was an experiment done by Bickman in 1974. This involved asking passers-by for a coin for a parking meter in a variety of different costumes, such as milkmen and Milgram's research into these variables is valid. It was done under laboratory conditions, it's repeatable, and it is scalable, although as we've already seen, there were massive ethical issues, which were similar to those of his initial research. It's important to realise that this repeated research on the same model was done weeks and months after, not in more learned decades. These severe ethical issues also prevented reliable research being done subsequently along similar methodological lines, such as an attempt to conduct research, incredibly, involving shocking a puppy in 1972, which never got off the ground and reasonably was widely discredited and did actually result, apparently, in criminal charges. The first situational factor that Milgram identified was proximity, closeness. Milgram varied his experiment in two ways to change proximity. Firstly, the distance between the participant and the learner was varied, and then the distance between the participant and the experimenter was varied. Remember that the participant is the one giving the shocks to someone they think is another participant, but is actually a confederate of the researcher. In one variation, the participant and learner were in the same room. The learner was visible to the participant, and their reactions were clearly displayed. In this variation, obedience rates dropped sharply, all the way down from 65% to 40%. In a second variation, the participant had to physically force the learner to touch the shock plate. Obedience in this case dropped from 65% to 30%. It's still incredible that 30% of people were prepared to force a hapless victim to touch a shock plate. This would seem to indicate that participants were less likely to obey and be prepared to inflict pain if their victim was close to them, visible to them, or they had to physically force the shock to happen. In another variation, the experimenter who instructed the participant to continue was called away by a fake phone call at the very start and left the room. In this variation, obedience dropped again to 20.5%. Many of the participants often pretended to give shocks or deliberately gave ones which were less severe and then lied about it. If the authority figure wasn't there to enforce their obedience, they didn't obey. A second situational factor that was identified is location. The initial research was done at Yale University, which is pictured here. This was and remains a prestigious and trusted university, widely known to the general public and widely respected. Milgram therefore theorized that a lot of the participants were willing to obey and inflict what they thought were genuinely dangerous and painful shocks because of the trusted institution that they were located in. Milgram therefore repeated the research, but changed the location. Instead of it being in a trusted and grand old university, it was moved to a run-down, dank office block in the inner city. When the location was changed, obedience dropped from 65% to 47.5%. Milgram therefore concluded that participants felt reassured and obligated to obey because of the setting and the location. They felt that research at the prestigious Yale University was important and that it was trustworthy, and therefore they could and should obey. A third situational factor was uniform. In the initial study, Milgram had instructed the experimenter, who remember were Confederates fully in on the method, to wear a grey lab coat. A lab coat is a type of uniform, and uniforms like lab coats convey a sense of knowledge, a sense of experience, qualifications, or authority. That's indeed what uniforms are partly for. Milgram therefore altered the attire of the experimenter. He had them called away and replaced by another Confederate who just professed to be a member of the public in casual, ordinary, everyday clothes. Obedience rates dropped all the way down to 20%, the lowest of any of the experiments. Part of the reason for obedience was the lab coat worn by the experimenter Confederate. Lab coats, as with most other uniforms, are an obvious clue to conformity. They indicate a social role, and with that social role come social expectations, and these increased obedience among participants. In the case of a lab coat, they indicate several things: that the research is genuine and that the person in the lab coat knows what they're doing. In fact, of course, anyone can wear a lab coat. Further research done later indicated that other types of uniforms also led to high levels of obedience, in particular that of a security guard. When we evaluate Milgram's situational factors, there are many things we need to consider. Some further research done later, such as by Bickman in 1974, did provide some further evidence for the effect of uniforms on obedience. Some psychologists, such as Orn and Holland, who did some research in 1968, suggested that changes in obedience were actually due to some participants realizing that the experiment was false, that they were being lied to, and that they were in fact not delivering the actual very painful shocks. Instead, they were just delivering fake shocks. In particular, even Milgram himself realized that the final variation, where the experimenter in a lab coat was called away and replaced by an ordinary member of the public in casual clothing, was obviously contrived. A large majority of people would see through that and realize what was happening. Taken together mean that Milgram's situational factors may lack internal validity. The experiment may not be valid in itself. The method may be flawed, for example, if people realize that what they're doing is a deception. Some experiments done in other cultures, especially in Europe, places like Spain and France and the UK, did later suggest that similar factors are present in most Western nations. It's unknown, however, at this date, if factors like location and uniforms are similar and universal worldwide. It's entirely possible that there may not be. Army uniforms vary wildly from nation to nation, and so the expectations that come with a uniform may also vary from nation to nation. One major issue with Milgram's situational variables is the presence of an alibi. Participants could use their obedience because they could place blame on the experimenter. It wasn't them who were actually responsible for the pain they were causing. Somebody else was in charge, somebody in a lab coat. One theory for explaining obedience is the agency theory. Following his research, Milgram developed the agency theory, which was published in 1973. When someone is acting on behalf of a known, valid external authority, they are placed into what is called an agentic state. An agentic state means that they are acting on behalf of that authority, rather than acting based on their own judgments and thinking. This is opposed to acting with autonomy. Acting in an agentic state is opposite to acting with autonomy. Because participants in Milgram's research were placed in this agentic state, feeling like they were acting on behalf of Yale University in this case, they didn't feel responsible for the pain they were causing, and they were therefore much more likely to obey. Some participants even asked who would be responsible if they harmed the fake learner. They didn't know they were fake. They were told that the experimenter in a lab coat would be responsible, and they would not. When told this, they usually continued. They were able to think and internalize the idea that they were merely acting as an agent. They were in an agentic state, and therefore they didn't have responsibility for the consequences. This situation was reinforced by the method of the experiments. Because they were paid at the start, participants felt they were in a social contract, which increased their obedience. They had an obligation, because they'd been paid, to complete the work. Most people begin interactions with others and given tasks with the intention, at least, to behave on their own, behave autonomously and independent, and not be influenced and comply. However, in Milgram's experiment, they very quickly switched and they behaved under the instruction from the experimenter, the confederate in a lab coat. This is known as agentic shift, ceasing to act autonomously and starting to act as an agent of a higher outside authority and therefore becoming an agent of that authority. Milgram was able to identify what he called binding factors, which kept people in this agentic state, where they remained convinced that they were acting on behalf of a larger authority, and they were an agent of it. The first factor was a reluctance to disrupt the research. Participants had been paid, and they were working for the prestigious Yale University. They therefore felt an obligation to complete the research task, at least to the best of their ability. A second was the location. As we've seen, the experiment took place at Yale, a trusted, prestigious and grand university. Participants therefore felt that their involvement was needed and that the research must be important. And thirdly, the authority figure. Milgram identified this as the third way of binding somebody into this agentic state. The apparent authority of the experimenter in a lab coat helped to maintain the agentic state of the participants and keep them obeying. Another way of explaining obedience is the concept of legitimacy. Our childhoods and our experiences condition us to regard some types of authority as being more legitimate than others. We feel they have a greater right or correctness in telling us what to do. We are taught as children, mostly, to regard certain groups of people, such as parents, teachers, the police and doctors, as legitimate sources of authority. They have a right to instruct us, and we should comply with their instructions. This legitimate authority usually has a widely agreed social role, a known place in society, often reinforced by the law, in the examples of the police, or by their own specific knowledge or expertise, for example in the case of doctors. As we've seen, Milgram investigated this when he changed the location of the research being done. He changed it from Yale University to a dank, dark, run-down office block in the inner city. Yale University, because of its status and known social role, had a perceived legitimate authority. The rundown office block had none of this. It had no such legitimate authority. And because of this, obedience rates dropped very sharply. Research in 1974 by Ricken confirmed this and reinforced it. Passers-by were instructed to pick up litter. They were much more likely to do this when the person giving the instruction was somebody with perceived authority, like a security guard. When the person giving the instruction was a milkman, they didn't. A security guard has a perceived legitimate authority due to the social expectations of their position, whereas a milkman doesn't. Another method for explaining obedience is what is known as the authoritarian personality. Researchers in the 1940s and 50s were, out of sad necessity, understandably eager to determine why so many of the guards and police and military and even general public in Nazi Germany had been so prepared to obey and comply with the Nazi regime, which had eventually resulted in the Holocaust and millions of deaths. Adorno, with a group of other researchers in 1950, about 5 years after the end of the World War II, developed the theory of the authoritarian personality as an attempt to explain this. The theory was that those who had received overly strict parenting often had authoritarian tendencies. This theory held that the extremely strict nature of people's upbringing had left them with a tendency to unquestioningly obey. This strict parenting had also left them feeling very constrained, a feeling which usually manifested as anger or rage or aggression. As individuals in receipt of this parenting were unable to direct these feelings towards their parents or other figures of authority, they directed it towards those who they perceived to be lesser or below them. And these lesser or lower figures received the brunt of this aggression or rage. This aggression, together with some other traits such as extreme conformity and a very rigid internal moral standard, became collectively known as the authoritarian personality, as a way to try and explain what had happened during the Holocaust and why so many ordinary Germans had been involved in this genocide. Following the development of this theory, Adorno and his group of researchers in 1950 measured the extent of an individual's authoritarianism on what was quickly called the F scale. In line with this research being into the past crimes of the Nazi regime, F stood for fascism, and the scale measured the fascist tendencies within the individual. This research was done using a group of 2,000 Americans. They were all very similar. They were all middle class, they were all white, and they were all male. And this was very much the socially dominant group in this time period of American history, where society was heavily segregated, especially between white people and black people. The research used choices between statements to determine the personality type of participants, especially their attitudes towards minority groups. Participants who agreed with statements such as obedience and respect for authority are the most important lessons a child can learn tended to have higher scores on the F scale. These individuals tended to also have a very high degree of respect for their parents, sometimes also a very high degree of fear. They identified with strong individuals, like, for example, Stalin, and strong policies. These individuals were usually highly conscious of their status or their perceived status. They demanded respect from those who felt they were below them, and they gave unquestioning obedience to people they felt were above them in this status. There are many factors that we need to take into account when evaluating this F scale. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, it was a long time ago, 70 years ago, and it was in the immediate aftermath of the worst conflict the world had ever seen, and the worst mass genocide the world had ever seen. The research showed a correlation, not a cause. In a causal relationship, one variable is a direct and sole cause of another. One thing directly leads to the next. But this was a correlation. Both a high F scale value and these personality types could be caused by a single outside third factor, something random such as year of birth or their profession, rather than one causing the other. This research was inherently biased. This was a major problem with the methodology of the research. The researchers knew the statements and views of the participants before they scaled them. The two were not measured independently of each other. This research was obviously politically biased. The F scale made an assumption, and that assumption was that authoritarianism was an inherently right-wing trait, when it was obvious from looking around the world that communist and socialist regimes of the left wing also displayed authoritarianism. It was not purely a right-wing issue. Another problem with the research is that it does not take into account the personality of the individual. Millions of Germans of all ages and all walks of life complied with and obeyed the Nazi regime, but they had a wide range of personalities. They wouldn't have all had an authoritarian personality, and there would have been individual differences between them all. We've already seen in both this video and preceding videos in this unit how social influence and conformity can be powerful. The norms, the views, and the information given by wider social groups can have a huge influence on how we as individuals behave in that group. Not everyone is influenced by the wider group around them, however. There are factors which can reduce the chances of conformity. When Milgram, to go back to Milgram's research, introduced another confederate who refused to give the learner a shock, he found that conformity rates among participants decreased sharply. The participants saw another dissenter, somebody who was prepared not to conform or obey, and they became much more likely to dissent themselves. Going back to Ash's research in 1951, when dissenters were introduced there, as we've seen, conformity with the wider group fell massively. People felt much more able and willing to dissent when somebody else had already done it before them, when somebody else had dissented first. Critically, however, this behaviour is still not full independence. Social support does not equal autonomous behaviour, however. People are still influenced by others, but this time the influence is to dissent from the wider group. It's influence from the existing dissenters, rather than an independent or autonomous decision to dissent from the wider group. Research has also indicated that personality types can influence your resistance to social influence. A researcher called Rotter in 1966 conducted some research to determine the personality types of individuals and if these personality types made them more or less likely to resist social influence. Participants chose from two statements, which put them into two neat, separate groups. One group, who felt that they alone were responsible for the quality of their life, was said to have an internal locus of control. They believed that control over their life rested with them and only with them. The other group, the opposite group, who felt that the quality of their life was at least partly based on random outside factors, which we can call luck, was said to have an external locus of control. They believed that the control over their life and the quality of their life rested outside of them. It wasn't something that they had control over. The people who had an internal locus, who believed that they were in sole control of their life, were much more resistant to social influence. They found it easier to not conform with the wider group, and they found it easier to dissent. They also found it easier to act autonomously or independently of a wider group. However, people with an external locus who felt that control over their life was luck-based, they were much less resistant to social influence. They found it harder to dissent from the wider group. They found it harder to dissent from a group consensus, a group decision, or even group behaviour. In practice, of course, not everybody falls neatly into one of these two groups, and this explanation is therefore not complete, but it does go some way towards explaining how different types of personalities can influence your resistance to social influence.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I have unexplained scratches.